It's a clip that's gone viral.
In places where there is a lot of choice that's been introduced, Florida, for example, the studies show that when there's a large number of students that opt to go to a different school or different schools, the traditional public schools, actually, the results get better as well.
Now, has that happened in Michigan? We're in Michigan, this is your home state.
Billionaire Education Secretary Betsy DeVos on CBS's 60 Minutes, unable to answer basic questions about education or the devastating impact she helped bring to her home state of Michigan, where multiple studies have found that schools, both traditional and charter, are among the worst in the nation when it comes to improving student achievement.
Have the public schools in Michigan gotten better?
I don't know overall. I can't say overall that they have all gotten better.
The whole state is not doing well.
Well, there are certainly lots of pockets where the students are doing well.
But your argument that if you take funds away, that the schools will get better is not working in Michigan, where you had a huge impact and influence over the direction of the school system here.
I hesitate to talk about all schools in general because schools are made up of individual students attending them.
The public schools here are doing worse than they did.
Michigan schools need to do better. There is no doubt about it.
We now bring you the fifth and final part of our interview with Noliwe Brooks, author of Cutting School. We spoke about efforts by Republican Governor Larry Hogan and right-wing Sinclair Broadcasting Project Baltimore, which argue that Baltimore schools are failing and the only solutions lie with DeVos-style deregulation.
Investigative reporting discovered 6 Baltimore city schools where not one single student was proficient in any state testing.
Of Baltimore City's 39 high schools, 13 had 0 students proficient in math.
So that was Larry Hogan and Chris Pabst of Project Baltimore, which is part of Sinclair Broadcasting. And, you know, they say Baltimore schools are in crisis because students are not doing well in their tests. There's entire schools that have no students proficient in math and in English. And they say, you know, this is a crisis and we need to act. And what they consistently point to is deregulation, but they call it greater accountability. Yeah. What's your response to this?
Well, the issue consistently around educating poor people, people who come from more modest backgrounds, who don't have 2 college-educated parents in the home, who are generally the students who perform poorly on these kinds of high-stakes tests. Rarely do we, again, talk about educational interventions. How are you teaching them? What are you teaching them? What are you doing to ensure that they're not failing the test, as opposed to there's something wrong with them? The tests are fine. There's something wrong with everything else. Let's have more tests. Let's dismantle everything because the tests are fine. And one of the things, if you said that Maryland has some of the wealthiest, highest performing school districts, I can almost guarantee you, having raised a child in the Princeton Public Schools, which is also a high performing school district, although at some point we had to put them in private school. But the thing that is true is that you have to fight those people to fail at wealthy schools. They figure out, what are your learning styles? What kind of help, what step did you miss in calculus so that you know, we can get you back on track. It is not one size fits all. It is not, you work harder, you do more homework, and we'll just test you more in order to make sure that those children are proficient. But consistently, in this country, we run away from providing struggling students with the same kinds of educational strategies and interventions and expectations as we do wealthy people. And I'm consistently saying, if, much like what Erica Huggins showed, what Marva Collins showed, what every high-performing traditional public school experience would show you, is if you educate kids the same way that we educate the wealthy, if we organize our classrooms in the same ways that we organize the classrooms of the wealthy, if we take an approach to curriculum that's not about one size fits all, but is about figuring out how to bring out the best, those kids will do just fine. But often what happens with poor people, it's like, well, we need more regulation. We need more, we need to fit them into a smaller and smaller hole. They need to be tested more. We need to ride the teachers harder. We need to hold the principals more accountable, and we need to close the schools when they do poorly. These are not strategies that we do with the wealthy, and I don't think that we should accept them as strategies for poor folks.
And what's the problem with judging low-income students, African-American students, based on test scores?
Well, so one of the things, there's two issues. One, if you look at across the country, you have wealthy folks, mostly white, middle-class students, rejecting this idea of high-stakes testing, organizing themselves into movements, like micro-movements.
The opt-out movement.
To opt out of high-stakes testing. And what you started to see happen from about 2016, 2015, 2016 on, is you found at the highest level of government response to. They're saying, this is too much. These tests, it's too much. It's not actual education. It's a bastardization of what education is supposed to be. All we're doing is being taught the test. We're just test-taking techniques.
Which is also big money.
Which is a huge, ever since No Child Left Behind, the explosion in capital behind testing and poor folks in particular. Is no small thing. But you're finding that when wealthy folks say it's too much, it's not working, we don't want to do it. President Obama put out a Facebook video saying this is too much. We need to do less of it. In poor communities, very often, those tests end up being responsible for closing schools. So for rich kids, when they say, this is like, ruining my whole vibe, making me anxious, I don't like it, you start to see a change around that. Well, let's reduce it. Let's be smarter about it. For kids, if they're in, say, charter schools, for example, that's not an option. Not taking tests is not an option. The money to be made for charter schools really is in the we do better with test scores. So they have to test these kids all the time. So there's a inequality to how we use the tests, what the test means, and the relationship of those tests to education. So that's one thing. The other thing is, no one is 100% sure why it is the case. But there's a lot of theories. There are a lot of different theories about why kids of color do not perform as well on average with standardized tests. Some of the theories are the tests really track your grandparents' educational achievement. So if you had grandparents that were college graduates and upper middle class, pretty consistently, their grandkids, the grandkids of those kinds of parents, do very well on tests. Some folks say that it's a stereotype threat, that there's all these ideas about people of color not doing well on tests. And even if you're not aware of it, you freeze when you get to the test. I'm not sure that we are 100% sure what the issue is with tests, but what we do know is that they advantage white people, and they advantage wealthy people, they advantage certain segments, and they disadvantage others. And so to build an entire educational ideology on a tool that we know, even if we can't explain why, we know that it's a racist instrument, that it just is I think indefensible. And so if you're the only solution that you can come up with, and the only issue that you see, if you have people not performing well on tests, the fact that they're not performing well on tests, the fact that there's not one person in the school performing well on tests does speak to some other issues, but the way to solve it is not like more testing. And in that little clip, you know, I didn't hear anything, and I rarely hear anything in conversations where people say, well, we need to be more aggressive in how we pull forth a high achievement. They are never really focusing on educational strategies that work, that have been proven to work. And so here and elsewhere, look at what has actually worked consistently for the least of these, and try that. I almost guarantee you it's not happening now.
Okay, we want to thank you so much for joining us. Noliwe Rooks, Director of American Studies at Cornell University, author of several books, most recent, Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education. It's one of the most important books about education you can read if you want to learn about the history and the current challenges and how we can overcome them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.